If you've been to the movies recently, you know just how many World War II films are hitting the big screen. Dunkirk, Jojo Rabbit, Hacksaw Ridge, the list goes on and on. We could be here all day if we wanted to be. Among these movies is the subcategory of Holocaust films, including Schindler's List, Inglourious Basterds, and The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. Of course, the Holocaust is more than just a Hollywood plotline. Much more. Millions of people were killed during the years of the Holocaust. The Washington Post says maybe even over 11 million. Of that estimated 11 million, at least 6 million were Jewish. It is nearly impossible to imagine how one man could have devised such a plan to kill that many people. It changes the way we look at human nature, haunting society with deep, unanswerable questions. Janna Malamud Smith puts these questions into words, writing, "How could anyone have done this? Why did no one stop them? And what would I have done?" For these reasons, the Holocaust still remains a source of trauma for many individuals, including those who are not eyewitnesses to the horror. Films such as the ones already mentioned and pieces of literature are used as coping mechanisms to deal with this trauma. Sometimes successful, sometimes inappropriate, these pieces of entertainment shape how we deal with our trauma related to the Holocaust. It is important to define trauma now, before I discuss it any further. The following quote explains it well. Dr. Bina writes, "Traumatic experience is subjective and differs from person to person, but among the various factors that are considered conducive to trauma, one always finds a real and significant experience of fear, helplessness, loss of control, and threat of annihilation, a state in which a person feels that their life, physical integrity, or mental integrity is in danger." I will talk mostly about the mental integrity category of trauma in the rest of this recording, but it is important to note that the other forms are still quite present today in the realm of Holocaust-related trauma. I said sometimes inappropriate earlier in reference to Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Basterds. Released in 2009, the film follows a group of American Jewish soldiers and their commanding officer, Lieutenant Aldo Raine. The Bastards, as Raine so lovingly named them, are on a hunt to find and kill as many Nazis as they can, with their ultimate goal being to kill Hitler himself. The film also tells the story of Shoshana Dreyfus, a French Jewish woman who is seeking revenge on the Jew hunter Hans Landa, who called for the brutal murder of her family and many other French Jews. The film is incredibly gory and violent, displaying realistic images of the scalping of German soldiers, and even a scene where a movie theater full of people is burned alive. In the scenes with the non-Jewish Raine and Landa, the Jewish characters become more like props than a real part of the story. For a Holocaust movie, this is problematic. The Jewish characters do end up getting to kill Hitler, but they were still treated like one group throughout the whole movie. This de-individualization is similar to Hitler's de-individualization of the Jews during the Holocaust. They are stripped of personality and turned into one unit under the control of non-Jewish characters. So, why do we still watch this movie with all its problems? Well, of course there's the heartthrob factor of Brad Pitt and Michael Fassbender. But most importantly, it gives a solution to Smith's question. Why did no one stop them? Audiences get to have the satisfaction of watching someone stop those responsible for the Holocaust, and for a few hours, they no longer have to question why no one tried in the 1940s. I also believe it has to do with trauma of non-witnesses to the events of the Holocaust. An article in The Atlantic states, "Exposed each day to the distress of others are second-line responders to tragedy. Humanitarian workers, therapists, social workers, lawyers, and journalists can develop traumatic stress disorders that mimic the PTSD of their clients, patients, and sources, down to the images of violence that can haunt a traumatized mind." The majority of people are not therapists and journalists, but this source shows that when what we expose ourselves to can create secondhand trauma. Therefore, all of these war movies coming out can be contributing to the trauma in non-witnesses, even if they are not Jewish. The reason we watch Inglourious Basterds, then, is to deal with that secondhand trauma, even if it may contribute to our trauma as well. The violence in the movie forces us to engage with our trauma because it reaches all the way into our subconscious where trauma also lives, getting to the roots of our issues that we usually don't choose to deal with. It is healthy for our brains to deal with these things, rather than keeping them locked away in the subconscious, which is an explanation to why Basterds has stayed so popular. Our brains like the release. Now, secondhand trauma is not just for unrelated non-witnesses, like I've mentioned. It also shows up in the children of Holocaust survivors. Many studies have shown that the second generation experiences trauma because of their parents' experiences with the Holocaust. According to Dr. Bina, this is called transgenerational transmission, and there are generally two patterns of this when transmitting Holocaust trauma from survivors to their children: direct and indirect. Indirect is most commonly found. Near explains indirect as when a parent's trauma resulting from the Holocaust leads to difficulty being a parent, leaving children feeling neglected. If there is this transgenerational transmission, then it can continue down the family tree into people of all ages and generations, proving that Holocaust trauma is definitely not disappearing and unfortunately not going to disappear anytime soon. The way many people deal with this trauma is through literature as well as film, as I've previously mentioned. Lots of members of the second generation population become authors of Holocaust literature. In an essay by Leslie O'Donoghue, there's an example given by one researcher that notes the need for many of the second generation to make sense of the senselessness of the Holocaust. Writing is an important way people can cope with trauma. Near touches on this subject as well. She writes, "Writers have the ability to experience intensively and identify with the psychological impressions of their environment, and to transmit them with refined vigor that is often stronger than the stories of those who actually experienced them. The writer is not committed to the facts and accurate documentation, but to the impact he wants to create in the reader's mind." Authors of Holocaust literature can express important feelings that may not otherwise be able to be expressed in daily life. And for readers, this literature can create empathy or help them feel more understood, since someone else has explained their trauma in better words than they ever could. Storytelling is an important part of coping. It allows us to express inexpressible things. I know when I read a story where the main character had OCD, it helped me greatly with my own OCD battle. For once, I felt represented, and even years later when I struggle with OCD spirals, I often turn to that book for comfort. And OCD is not trauma, but it is a form of mental illness, which I know can be helped by great emotional storytelling. One storyteller that comes to mind is Shalom Auslander. His work, Holocaust Tips for Kids, is an interesting piece of literature. It jumps to a different topic every few paragraphs, covering a lot of ground in just 22 pages. After a brief note, the text starts out by saying, "If the Nazis come in the middle of the night and try to take me away to a concentration camp, these are the things I plan to take with me. Some food, my allowance money, a sleeping bag, my Walkman, a toothbrush, a knife from the kitchen, my nunchucks, some ninja throwing stars, a flashlight, and my comic books." Despite its innocent vocabulary, it's quite a dark passage. Auslander shows the trauma Jewish children still experience today by writing a fictional narrative about a child's fears in a way they would talk about them casually. The contrast was especially eye-opening for me, as well as the section where he details all of the ways he could escape from the house if, quote, Nazis break in. I had never considered before reading this how Jewish people still may fear that another Holocaust could happen. It makes total sense, though. I would be scared too if a group I associated with was strategically killed less than 100 years ago. I mean, Auslander writing that they'll probably make New York City into a ghetto is terrifying, even for me as a Christian woman. Holocaust Tips for Kids connects back to the film industry mentioned earlier because throughout is the mention of multiple famous movies and entertainment figures. Bruce Lee is one of these actors, mentioned on almost every page. Harry Houdini, the escape artist, is brought up multiple times as well. Entertainment shaped the way Auslander viewed the world, and even shaped the way he viewed such a traumatic event as the Holocaust. This character he's created deals with his trauma by connecting with Lee, a descendant of a European Jewish butcher, and connecting with the Jewish Houdini. Human connection is important when we are dealing with difficult things. Look at the COVID-19 pandemic. People across the nation are coming together in ways they never have before because they are fearing for their lives. A few months ago, the idea of making this video made me very uneasy. I'd had no proper education on the Holocaust, and growing up in a closeted anti-Semitic area, I was afraid I'd say all the wrong things. I'm in no way anti-Semitic. I love and accept people of all religions, even if that religion is not my own. But it is hard to know what crosses the line if there isn't any line for the people around you. I realize now, with a lot of reflection, that we all deal with trauma from the events of the Holocaust that I couldn't even fathom before. I often find myself losing sleep over the fact that my ancestors stood idly by while millions of innocent people were being killed, and more so, I find myself wondering why I'd never heard about it all before. I guess my trauma, although I don't feel as if my worries are as strong as that word makes them out to be, is the constant questioning of whether I'd stand up to help innocent people or if I'd be like my ancestors. Watching lots of films and engaging with literature in the last few weeks has helped a lot with that fear and that question. I am forced to consider what type of person I'd be in that situation, and as I've learned with my other struggles, facing your fears is important. That's how literature and film shape how we deal with our trauma. They force us to accept it's there and give us options and opinions on how we're going to deal with it. It also gives us connections not normally available to us in our daily lives. The entertainment industry is beautiful in that way, I think, even if they sometimes get their interpretations wrong. Entertainment allows for important connections that really cannot be formed in a way outside of entertainment, especially as it pertains to live entertainment. I think that's why right now, living in the middle of a pandemic where live entertainment isn't possible is especially horrifying. People deal with their trauma, Holocaust-related or otherwise, with connection. And entertainment is important to make those connections. Thinking back, I'm not sure why I decided to take literature of the Holocaust, but maybe there was a part inside of me that knew I needed to take it. It's important to be educated, even if it forces you to ask hard questions of yourself. Maybe that's why it's so important, because it does allow you to ask the hard questions, even if it's really hard. Thank you for listening.